Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today for this second and last lecture by Jason Giannetti this year on myth and religion, although we are already talking to him about next year, trying to get that on the calendar. Thank you all for coming, whether this is your first lecture this fall or if you've been to all 6 of our cultural lectures. We've had a great time. These lectures are supported by the Friends of the Council on Aging and the Friends of the Gleason Library, and they are both always happy to have new members any time of year, but I think they do a membership and donation drive around this time of year, so keep your eye out for those flyers in your mailbox. And I just ask everyone to remember to silence or turn off your phones. This talk is being filmed for local cable, so if you know anyone who couldn't make it, it will be available to watch on local cable and online later on. And I'd also like to thank Sarah from Bridges by Epic for bringing today's wonderful refreshments. So if you didn't get anything on the way in, please help yourself on the way out and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Can everybody hear me okay, even in the back?
No.
Last time I was here, I said it feels like coming home, and I have hecklers now, so it really feels like coming home. Thank you for coming back on this beautiful autumn day. I wanted to pick up today's lecture with a couple of comments that were made to me at the end of the last lecture last week. The first comment was made to me after the cameras were off and everybody was sort of milling about, and it was sort of made in private, and it had to do with the story of the raft from the Buddhist tradition. And I'll just refresh your memories, which goes like this. The Buddha says, if you're on a dangerous side of a river where there's lions and tigers and bears, knew that was coming, and you see across the river the placid, tranquil side, that shore seems to be safe and one of repose, and you want to get to the other side, you would then build yourself a raft. And you would take that raft and you would get across the rushing waters, the dangerous waters, to the other side. And then the Buddha asks, once you got to the other side, what would you do with that raft? Would you pick it up and carry it on your head? And to this, his disciples answered, no, that would be ridiculous. And that's the end of the story. Now, as we explained in the last lecture, the dangerous side of the river is what in Buddhism is referred to as samsara, meaning this world that we live in here, one of pain and suffering and death. The tranquil side of the river is what's known in Buddhism as nirvana, whatever that means, the relief from all of the troubles and problems of this world. And the raft in this little parable would stand for perhaps the whole religion of Buddhism, or the myths, as I suggested last week, the fables that help you to figure this out, the parables. So it's a parable about a parable in some ways. And once you get to that nether shore, you no longer need the raft, says the Buddha. Now, somebody came up to me after the lecture and said, that doesn't make sense. How could Buddhism be arguing that once you achieve the goal of Buddhism, you no longer need the religion? No other religion in the world does that, was what this person said to me. And I said, you're right. That's why one of my favorite authors on Buddhism, Alan Watts, wrote a book called Buddhism, the Religion of No Religion. So it's paradoxical. It's very strange. It's unique in many ways. Most other organized religions say, stick to the religion, right? There's no point at which you no longer need the religion. Keep it forever and ever. Buddhism takes a different approach, but we're going to return to that notion in a little bit. I have a lot of stories to tell you today, so I might speak a little bit quickly. I will leave time for questions at the end in case I say anything too quickly. The second thing that I want to bring up is a question that was asked during the Q&A session of the last lecture. And it's stuck with me all week, and it's where I want to begin today's lecture. The question was, there's a lot of different ways of reading and interpreting myths. As we know, there's lots of different ways that one can interpret the Bible, right? From very fundamentalist, sort of factual reading of the surface language of the text, to fanciful, mystical interpretations. And the person asked, what are the guidelines? How do we figure this out? And I gave my best job at giving an answer on the spot, and it's been sort of sticking in my craw since then, and I've been turning it over. And I want to return to that. And I want to make that the beginning point of today's lecture. Joseph Campbell has a great analogy. Remember when you studied for tests and there were analogous statements? A is to B as C is to D, that sort of thing. Well, I need you to use that part of your brain right now. Joseph Campbell says that the dream is to the individual as the myth is to the culture. The dream is to the individual as the myth is to the culture. Now let's start with the first part of that. The dream is to the individual. So when we dream, our unconscious, if you buy into Freud and his student Jung, our unconscious is speaking to us, our conscious, in symbols, in images. And those symbols and those images have meaning for the individual. This is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of books of dream interpretation. Because those images and those symbols have their origin deep in your individual unconscious. And so they mean something specific to you. And it is the job, one might say, of psychoanalysis to figure out what that meaning is for you, right? If you dream, to use a very popular image from Freud, if you dream of a cigar, it might not mean for you what it means for the person next to you, right? It has connections deep in your past, deep in your perhaps repressed memories. And so it's going to have a special meaning for you that the long and arduous work of psychoanalysis strives to figure out. Now, if we all buy into that, let's look at the second part of Campbell's statement. The dream is to the individual as the myth is to the culture. The myth is like the cultural dream. It's a presentation in symbol and in image of things that mean something to us as a culture, whatever culture that is. And it gets projected, if you will, in a way that many people find meaningful and powerful. So to use a few examples to get us warmed up in this, take for instance the Christmas tree, right? It doesn't make sense that in a few weeks' time, there'll be all sorts of people going out to the woods, cutting down what seem to be perfectly healthy trees that are no good in the state that they're in for anything, right? You can't really use them to burn. You can't use them, if you cut them down at the stem, you can't just transplant them. There's no root system. And then to do what with them? Bring them inside the house. complete and full. That makes no sense. So one of the ways to figure out is something a myth in the culture is imagine that you're an alien from a different planet and you land here and you see people doing this. What would that mean? Well, what does it mean? What does it mean in this culture? You can't phone a friend. What does it mean in this culture?
It means hope.
Hope? I don't see the connection between a green tree and hope.
The return of life.
The return of life? What does that mean? We're killing a tree. How does that mean the return of life?
In the middle of the darkness.
The return of life in the middle of the darkness. Have you kept that tree past January 15th? Yes?
Life that endures through the winter?
Getting warmer. Right? The evergreen is a symbol of life that does endure through the winter. And now we have to take it to the next step. It is a symbol of the triumph of life over death. Right? It's the symbol of the triumph of life over death. And at this Christmas season, it is a symbol of Jesus as resurrected as the triumph of life over death. So it's a cultural symbol. We could do the same thing, for instance, of a crucifix. At the time that it was used, what was a cross?
A tree.
What?
A tree.
A tree? Oh, it was made out of wood. An instrument of execution, right? The cross in Jesus' time was the equivalent of the electric chair. Now imagine you go to a different country in a different culture, and in that country and culture, you find little electric chairs hanging on the wall of living rooms and bedrooms and churches and around the people's necks, right? And you go to the store, you want to buy a present for somebody, and they're selling jewelry that is made out of images of little electric chairs. You would think, this place is nuts. Wow, what a culture of death. But what does the cross mean for this culture?
Resurrection.
Resurrection, which is again what?
Life.
The symbol of the triumph of life over death. So you see, you can't read these symbols on their surface level. You need to have a connection to the culture in order to do a better interpretation. Yes?
I believe it is different.
How's that?
Christ taught love. Love thy enemy. And the only way he could, like Socrates, the only way he could believe democracy is to show that you're willing to die for it. Death on a cross, like you said, was a punishment of the worst kind. And Christ goes on the cross and says, forgive them for they know what they do. He's demonstrating that he believes in what he said, that you have to love your enemy, and you're willing to die for it, and you'll forgive your enemy. That's what it means to me.
Okay.
Don't like it around your neck.
Okay. So, we have a comment, a different interpretation that the image of the cross is an image of willing to die because of one's love, not only for one's loved ones, but even for one's enemy. This again shows the plasticity with which there can be multiple interpretations. But the bigger point that I'm getting at here is that on the surface level, the literal level, these images wouldn't make sense, right? How many times have you woken up from a dream and you said, wow, that was weird? Those, you didn't say it to yourself this way, but those symbols made no sense to me. And you would have to spend a lot of time studying what those symbols mean, partially because your unconscious is not only trying to speak to you, but also keeping it from you, right? So you'd have to spend a lot of time figuring out what those symbols mean for you before you could properly interpret the text, which is the dream. Having said that, I want to look at a few stories depending on time, we'll see how many we get to, in order to do some of this harder work. Some stories that you might already be familiar with. So we're going to start with some Jewish stories. Now, Martha, who's the librarian here, she can vouch for this. I said, is there a Bible here? It's a library, right? I thought we'd find a Bible. So we went down, and she, very randomly, and she'll vouch for this, picked this Bible off the shelf. It is the fully revised 4th edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible, New Revised Standard Version with the Apocrypha. That's the full title. And I opened it up, and it turns out that it's edited by Michael D. Coogan and Mark Brettler. What does that mean to you? Probably nothing. But both of them were my professors when I was in graduate school. I didn't have a hand in picking this one. This is the one that it happened to be. So, yeah, there you go. So I want to begin with a story that you're probably familiar with, which is the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. You remember at the end of the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve get expelled from the garden. And I want to read to you just the very end of that, which is from Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. He, meaning God, drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. Now you'll recall that Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge, right? And the tree of knowledge and the tree of life were at the center of the garden. There's a lot that I could do with that, but I'm going to try to stay laser focused here. So there is what that is protecting the tree of life, making sure that they cannot re-enter to this garden? The cherubim. What the heck is a cherubim?
An angel.
Perhaps it's some sort of unearthly being. Let's leave it at that. Now, the exercise we're doing here is to try to understand the text in its own terms. Now, these myths that we're dealing with are providing for us many different hints, right? The ancients didn't have a way of highlighting for us. They didn't have a way of writing things in italics. They didn't have a way of saying to us, hey, dummy, pay attention, right? But they try to do this in very different forms. One of those forms is, there's a simple way of doing it, which is numbers. As you're probably familiar, there's certain numbers that point out important passages, like the number 7, or the number 10, or sometimes the number 50, right? Or the number 40. Let's look at the number 40 for a moment. I'm getting away from what I wanted to point to here, but just to show you how the text, and it's not only the Hebrew Bible, it's many different myths around the world, use numbers as a way of highlighting. What is significant about the number 40? And let me show you some points in the Bible where the number 40 appears. With Noah's Ark, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay? And the Jews were in the desert after leaving Egypt for 40 years. What is important about the number 40?
It means a period of time.
It is a period of time, but everything's a period of time. A long period of time, 40 days, 40 years.
Longer than a lifespan in those days.
Could have been, maybe. Do we have any medical professionals here? No, not a one? Surprising. Do we have anybody who has been pregnant and given birth here? Okay. How long are you pregnant?
Forever.
forever.
39 weeks? 40 weeks.
40 weeks. We commonly say 9 months, but the more accurate term is 40 weeks. Anytime you see the number 40 in the Hebrew Bible, it is indicating rebirth. Rebirth. The birth of the nation, 40 years in the desert, the rebirth of humanity after it became corrupt with Noah. So that's just one way that the Bible underlines and highlights things. Another way is it uses words very specifically. So we just saw that when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, a cherubim was placed at the entrance to protect the tree of life. When else in the 5 books of Moses does the word cherubim appear? Who said that? All right, we have a winner here. And I don't even think that she Googled it. That was too quick. Exodus chapter 25, verse 18. I shall read for you. Chapter 25, verse 18. This is God speaking. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. You shall make them of hammered work at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at the one end and 1 cherub at the other. Of 1 piece with the mercy seat, you shall make the cherubim as its 2 ends. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings. They shall face one to another. The faces of the cherubim shall be turned toward the mercy seat. Now, you all are probably familiar with this image from Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? The famous ark in that story is this ark. And God commands that it is cherubs that are to be the ornaments for the place where the Torah will be held. Well, if you take story 1 and you take story 2, what is it that this myth is trying to tell us? Don't whisper, say it aloud.
The tree of life is the Torah.
The tree of life is the Torah, or the Torah is the tree of life, right? That this ark that carries the Torah is a portal back to the Garden of Eden. This is the way in. We humans are not forever forbidden from entering. There is another way in, and here it is. Here it is. And interestingly, what do we need to use? We need to use the knowledge that we gained from the tree of knowledge in order to get back into it. So this is one of the ways that the Bible is speaking to us. We just need to understand it on its own terms. Let's go now to the New Testament. As you know, there are 4 canonical Gospels, meaning 4 Gospels that got the stamp of approval by the church. And those are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark is, scholars believe, the oldest of those 4, and also probably the one that is most connected with the Jewish roots. And I want to turn to a passage that is unique to the Gospel of Mark to try to understand it on its own terms from the meaning that it would have for the culture to which it was speaking. So this is when Jesus is crucified. It's from Mark chapter 15, verse 33. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. It's this last sentence that I want to focus on here. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. First of all, what is that referring to? Does anybody know? What's that?
The Holy of Holies.
The Holy of Holies. Remember, at this time, the temple in Jerusalem was still standing. It's actually the second temple. And in the center of the temple is what's called the Holy of Holies, or the most holy spot. And that is where it's believed that God dwelled on earth, in that spot. And there was a curtain that kept it closed, except for on the high holiday of Yom Kippur, which was the one day that the high priest was allowed to go in there to ask repentance for the entire community. Also an important fact. Now, why would Mark include this statement that no other gospel uses, that the curtain was torn from top to bottom at the time that Jesus died? What is Mark trying to tell us?
But Jesus is the way to God.
That Jesus is the way to God. That's your interpretation.
Just suggesting.
There's no penalty for being wrong. I tell my students that all the time. No penalty for being wrong.
Jesus is the forgiveness for the world.
Jesus is the forgiveness for the world. We're going to come back to that.
God left from that place?
That God left from that place. You might think so, but no.
Well, if they tear the curtain from top to bottom, then the curtain's going to be useless, and everything that's inside is going to be exposed.
Everything that's inside is going to be exposed. So you would think that Jesus' dying is now exposing God for the world. All possible, plausible, interesting suggestions. But we have to become more familiar with the culture of the time and what this would mean at that time. Back then, and still today, for Jews, if you lost a close relative, if your father or mother, brother, sister, or child died, or spouse, the way that you show that you are in mourning is by ripping a piece of your clothing. This is a Jewish tradition. Mark is Jewish, and he's speaking to a Jewish audience. When the shroud that is covering the Holy of Holies rips miraculously in two from top to bottom, this is saying this is the only clothes that God wears. And God is in mourning for the loss of God's Son. It's a powerful image if you understand the cultural context that it comes from and that it's speaking to. So all of this is to show that in interpreting myths, back to the question from last week, how do we do it? What is a reasonable interpretation and what is outlandish? Well, just again, as I said at the beginning, just like with psychoanalysis, you have to get into what it means for the culture out of which it grows. So those are a few myths from the Western tradition. I'm going to come back to the Western tradition in just a little bit. But now I want to turn to the East to suggest a few stories that speak to us in their mythic garb and have something to say to us and focus on how they have to say it. So let's start with Hinduism. Hinduism, very different from the religions of Judaism and Christianity. Hinduism has sometimes been called a pantheistic religion, meaning that everything is God. Everything is God. Now, we need to try to understand this in a better way, because this doesn't seem to be, for most of us here, I'd submit, doesn't seem to be our natural instinct, right? Like this podium, you're telling me this podium is God, right? The rocks outside of the library, you're telling me that's God? Well, that's what Hinduism is telling. In Hinduism, there is a theology, and I don't want to get too much into it, but I want to try to suggest it, where there are many, many different gods for different things, perhaps limitless numbers of gods. But on a higher level, you might say, there's 3 extremely important gods. And what I love about Hinduism is it's so logical in its theology. The 3 important gods are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is the god of creation. Vishnu is the god of preservation. And Shiva, can you guess? The god of destruction, right? Pretty easy to remember. Beginning, middle, and end, right? Just like Aristotle said, every story has to have beginning, middle, and end. Samuel Beckett came along and said, yes, but not in that order. So we have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and it is said that these 3 deities are manifestations or aspects of the supreme deity. And the supreme deity is known as Brahman, with an N at the end. Brahman. The supreme deity, it's said in all of the religious texts of Hinduism, is without attributes or characteristics. Brahman is without attributes or characteristics. Now, let's think about that for a moment. What is an attribute? An attribute is like old, young, certain height, certain weight. Characteristic would be, green, red, yellow, blue, round, whatever. How can Brahman, the supreme deity, be a god without attributes or characteristics? Because when we speak about Brahman, if we say that Brahman is a supreme deity, supreme and deity are both attributes and characteristics. So already, when I'm trying to tell you what Brahman is, I've already made a mistake. And so there's a later philosopher in Hinduism named Shankara, who is known for what is called negative theology. Shankara would go around, people would ask him, what is Brahman? And Shankara would say, neti, neti, not this, not that. So there's no way of speaking about Brahman, right? Anything and everything that you say about Brahman is going to be wrong. The flip side of that is, well, we can say very, very fanciful things that can help us to understand how we're wrong. And those are what we call myths. One of the most widely read stories in the Hindu tradition is what's called the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is a pretty concise story about a king named Arjuna. It comes from a much longer, sprawling epic called the Mahabharata. We're not going to get into that. We're just going to focus on the Bhagavad Gita. Now, let's think about this again for a moment. There's Brahman, the deity without attributes or characteristics. And then there's those three deities below that I told you about. There's Brahma, creation, Vishnu, preservation, and Shiva, destruction. Vishnu, the preservation deity, it says, comes along and has an avatar appear on earth every once in a while when things look like they're going downhill. So an avatar is a flesh and blood incarnation of that deity, of Vishnu. And there's been, depending on who you ask, a number of different avatars over the years. One was a fish, one was a turtle, one was a monkey, one was a man lion. I think that there's sort of 8 of them. Also very logical, because if you look at the 8 as they're presented in Hinduism, remarkably, they follow the same evolutionary path as Darwin points out. I don't know how that happened, but they go in the same chronological evolution as Darwin suggests. The last one, or the next to last one, depending on who you ask, is Krishna. Krishna appears in this text that I just told you about, the Mahabharata, most famously in the Bhagavad Gita. And the way it starts is like this. I picture it as being a great Cecil B. DeMille epic movie. The opening scene is seen from the clouds, and the camera goes through the clouds, and you eventually see the earth down below. And on the earth, you see a giant army, vast as far as the eye can see to the left. And on the earth, you see a giant army, vast as the eye can see on the right. And then the camera zooms in, and it goes up to each individual person, and you see them in their garb for war. They're carrying spears, and they have their helmets on and their shields, and some are on horses, and they're all ready to go. They look angry, they look mad, they look ready to fight and kill. And then the camera zooms in on one chariot, and in this chariot is a young man who looks grief-stricken. And his charioteer takes him into the middle of the no man's land between the two armies. And we see this grief-stricken man turn to his charioteer and say, "Am I to kill the people on that side over this piece of dirt? I look out over there and I see husbands and fathers and teachers and brothers. And I look out over our own army and I see husbands and fathers and teachers and brothers. And I'll be damned if I am going to be the cause of any of them to lose their lives over what? Over some real estate? Over some dirt?" Now this person speaking is Arjuna, the prince or the king, the leader of the army. And he's speaking to his charioteer. And his charioteer happens to be the incarnation, the avatar of Vishnu, the preservation deity. He's speaking to Krishna, who is the charioteer, the one driving his chariot. Every once in a while, when I'm driving, I'll see a bumper sticker that says, "Jesus is my co-pilot." I just wonder, in that movie rendition that I just gave you, if you turn to the back of the chariot, it says, "Krishna is my co-pilot." I don't know. But anyhow, that's who's driving the chariot, and Krishna turns to Arjuna. And the first time I read this, I was just shocked. I was floored by what he had to say, because first, I was floored by Arjuna's keen insight. I was like, wow, this is like the whole insight of religion, and love thy brother and all this other stuff. Love thy enemy, right? Arjuna gets it. Where are we going to go from here? Like, this is page 1. But Krishna turns to Arjuna and says, "Be a man. Stop crying like a little woman. I'm just using the language that's in the text. Fight and kill. I was like, uh-oh, this is very concerning. Wow, how can he say that? And then the book goes on to have the whole story that Krishna tells Arjuna. And the story that Krishna tells Arjuna is almost Shakespearean in its style. Krishna says to Arjuna, what are you worried about? Do you think that swords can kill? Do you think that flames can kill? No. This stuff, this mortal coil, this flesh and blood, it's like clothing. When it wears out, you toss it away and you get new ones. Same thing with your flesh and blood. When it's done, you toss it away. But that does not kill the spirit. The spirit lives on. The spirit is immortal. There is reincarnation. There is rebirth. And for the time that you are here on this planet, you have a role to play. This is like so many players on the stage. You're wearing costumes. You have a role to play. And so play your role. You've been assigned the role of leader of the army. You can't shirk that. If you shirk it, then you will incur bad karma. And that will ensure a bad rebirth. So, this is the story of the Bhagavad Gita in a nutshell. And Krishna goes on to answer a number of the questions that Arjuna raises about these metaphysical things, such as rebirth and karma and what happens next. And Arjuna asks, what sort of karma is the best karma? And Krishna answers a whole long series of answers about, it's good to do your job, right? Bill Belichick would like that answer. It's good to offer prayer and sacrifice. But best of all is yoga karma. Yoga karma. And what does that mean? Here is the most crucial insight of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says the best form of karma is when you do an action without concern for the result. When you do an action for its own sake. Right? You do an action for its own sake. Now, this might be very difficult for us to understand. So, I'm going to put it into a story that we might be able to understand. How many of you have seen the great movie starring Bill Murray, Groundhog's Day? Okay, for you, those of you who haven't, I'd recommend that you see it. Spoiler alert, I'm going to talk to you about it. In Groundhog's Day, Bill Murray plays a reporter who's egotistical and ladder climbing and cruel to his co-workers, and he gets sent on a job to Puxatawny, Pennsylvania to report on Groundhog's Day, a job that he hates because he has such a big ego, he knows he's better than this little time stuff. He goes out there, he does his reporting, there's news that a snowstorm is coming, that he'll have to stay an extra day. He can't get any way out. He's really upset about this. He goes to sleep in this little bed and breakfast. He wakes up the next morning, except it's not the next morning. It's Groundhog's Day all over again. It's the same thing. He thinks he's going nuts. He goes through the whole day. Everything's a little kooky. He can't get out because of the snowstorm. He goes to sleep. He wakes up the next day. It's not the next day. It's Groundhog's Day all over again. This keeps on happening. Eventually, we get the sense that many days goes by. Eventually, he's like, I'm sick of this. And he tries to kill himself. He gets into a bathtub with an electric toaster plugged in. He kills himself. He wakes up the next morning, Groundhog's Day. He jumps off the clock tower in the center of town. He wakes up the next day, Groundhog's Day. He can't get out. He eventually realizes, well, I'm here. I might as well have some fun. And so he, realizes when the bank is going to make its transfer of money, and he manages to steal all this money, and he goes out on town and he tries to seduce women left and right, and all sorts of different things happen. He has a good time, but eventually that becomes boring. And so then he figures, okay, well, I'm here, I'm stuck here, well, let's see what else I can do. And so he takes piano lessons, he learns to do ice sculptures, he learns all sorts of different talents, and, that seems okay for a while. And then a little more time goes by, and then he realizes he gets the backstories of all the different people in town. And then he goes around and he helps them. He starts helping them. And he just is doing this. He realizes he's stuck, he's trapped, so why not? And he helps a kid who's falling out of a tree, and he helps a homeless person and all these different people. And then, of course, because in the West, we don't have a sense of nirvana, right? Our idea of nirvana is a romantic happy ending. So, of course, the end to this story, spoiler alert, is he manages to get the female lead to fall in love with him. And when he does this, but unintentionally, right? It just so happens she falls in love with him because he's changed. Suddenly, the next day when he wakes up, it's the day after Groundhog's Day. This little story, very Western story, is exactly what Hinduism is telling us. That we go round and round and round again. After so many times around, right? Like if you go to enough amusement parks, you realize that all the different rides, they're all the same rides, they're just in different garb, right? The wild teacups are the same as the Minnie Mouse spinning or whatever it is, And you eventually get bored of it. But then you might eventually realize, oh, I can do something with the time that I'm here. And I could help others. Not to gain some reward, but just as a selfless act. Notice in the story about Groundhog's Day, the external factors never change. What changes is his attitude towards them and his own actions. What once was a hell has become a heaven for him. And this is the story that Krishna is telling Arjuna. The yoga karma, the selfless action, the action that is done not with any view to a reward, is the highest form of action. So, that's Hinduism. We'll turn now very briefly, because I see that I'm taking up a lot of time with these different stories, take a brief approach to Buddhism. In Buddhism, which grows out of Hinduism, there are a number of ideas that stay the same, but there are some radical approaches to them. So the idea that you have to play your role, this is very rigid in Hinduism. Everybody is assigned a certain role in society. You've heard of the caste system, right? Where there's Brahmins, the priests on the top, And then there's warriors, where Arjuna would be from. And then there's the agriculture and people who are merchants. And then there's the so-called untouchables, right? You're born into a class, and throughout your life, you're supposed to play different roles. Maybe a student, and then a homemaker. And then you go into what's called semi-retirement, where you spend some time of your life doing rituals. And then full retirement, which is being completely devoted to religion. So there's time horizontally across, there's roles horizontally across time, and there's roles vertically depending on your role in society. Buddhism says, to hell with all that. Anybody can achieve nirvana at any time. At any time. And the big difference between Hinduism and Buddhism is Hinduism says that everything is Brahman. Everything is Brahman. The central teaching of the Upanishads, which came before the Bhagavad Gita, these philosophical writings, is Tattvam Asi. Thou art that, meaning you are the supreme deity. You are Brahman. Or as it's also formulated, Atman, which means self, Brahman. You, yourself, are Brahman. You are the supreme deity. That's the central teaching of Hinduism. Now, a lot of you might raise your hand saying, if I'm the supreme deity, how come I feel like me? I don't feel supreme or like a god. And Hinduism has an answer for you. The answer is Maya. Maya is the word for divine illusion. Divine illusion. The reason why you don't recognize yourself as Brahman, as the supreme deity, is because you're deluded. You just haven't seen yourself correctly. But if and when you do see yourself correctly, you will realize that you are Brahman. I don't know if we have enough time for experiment. I'll do one experiment. But for the experiment, I need a victim. I mean a volunteer. I'm sorry, I mixed those two things up. One volunteer who has not worked with me before. Do I have anybody? Come on up here. What's your name?
Diane.
Diane, say hello to the studio audience.
Hi, studio audience.
Okay, say hello to everybody at home.
Everybody at home, too.
Okay. Have we ever worked together, Diane?
No.
Okay. I haven't prepped you for this at all?
No.
Okay. Diane, I'm going to ask you one question. I need you to answer quickly because we're running out of time. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. Diane, who are you?
I am a woman.
No, I didn't ask for your gender. Try again.
I am a person.
I didn't ask for your species.
I am a being.
I didn't ask for your ontological status. I'm asking who you are.
I am a thinking person.
Again, not species, and I'm not asking what you do.
Well, I
Last chance.
am a body of hemoglobin and stuff.
I'm not asking for your biology. You may sit down. If you ask yourself very seriously, who am I? And you do not answer in a way that is what I would call, or Buddhism would call, relative, right? I'm a mom, I'm a dad, right? That's relative to other people. If you don't answer in a way that has some sort of category of understanding, right? I'm a person, right? You will find that you can't answer the question. You can't answer the question because everything that you answer is going to be a characteristic or an attribute, but not essentially who you are. And Hinduism would say, when you realize that, you realize that who you really are is Brahman. All the other stuff is just your acting clothes. Right? If I say I'm a lawyer sometimes when I'm acting like a lawyer. If I say I'm a teacher sometimes when I'm acting like a teacher. But essentially, I am no different from Brahman, and so are you, is what Hinduism is getting at. Buddhism has a different take on this. Buddhism agrees. Right? All those answers that you give about who you are relative. Or as Buddhism would call it, dependent. They depend on other things. But essentially, Buddhism won't say that you are the supreme deity. Buddhism will say, you're nothing. You are nothing. You are empty of any essential characteristics. Right? So one religion is megalomaniacal, and the other one is quite humbling. Right? But how does it get to nothing? This has everything to do with the Buddha's journey. The Buddha, I'm not going to take too much time to tell you the whole story, but he started off very wealthy, the son of a king. But he soon discovered certain truths about life. That we get sick, we grow old, and we die. And this caused him great suffering, great torment. And the particular thing that caused him great suffering and great torment is the same thing that causes you great suffering and great torment. Impermanence. Right? If you don't do anything to your house, the wind and the rain and the snow and the leaves and everything else is eventually going to wear it away. If you drive your car, even if you drive it at 40 miles an hour and very carefully, it's eventually going to rot out and rust. And as all of us know too well, as the Western philosopher Boethius once said, either eventually all of our worldly belongings and loved ones are going to leave us, or we're going to leave them. Right? Everything passes. Everything is impermanent. Nothing abides. Nothing stays. And this gave the Buddha great, great distress. And so one day he sat down under the Bodhi tree and meditated on this. And he finally came up with a solution to the problem of impermanence. And guess what the solution was? No one? The solution was impermanence. He said if everything is impermanent, that includes me. In other words, there is no abiding self. There is no Atman. This thing that I call myself is an illusion. It's not real. It's a concept. So we have a little bit of time left. I'm going to do something I don't always do. I'm going to perform a magic trick for you. Has anybody ever seen my magic trick? Anybody here? No? Okay. It's my only one, so I'm going to give it my best shot here. Okay. So what I want you all to do, I want you to look carefully. Cameras, make sure you got a close-up of this, okay? Because it's only going to happen once and it's going to happen quickly. Okay. Do you see what this is? What is this?
A fist.
My fist, right? Yeah. Okay, you all see it. You all said it, right? Now, I need you to watch carefully because I'm going to make it disappear. We're going to count on 3, okay? You all got this? Ready? Count with me. 1, 2, 3! Huh? Huh?
How did he do that?
I know. If I had more tricks, I'd go to Faneuil Hall and I would make more money. But the question is, Not how did he do that, but where did it go? Where did it go?
Its form.
It changed its form. Where did it exist? In your heads. The concept of fist and the concept of hand only exists in your head, right? Now, that might be a very important concept, right? I'm a lawyer, so there's a thing called assault and battery. If you get hit by a fist in a court of law, that's different from being hit by a hand, right? So these concepts can be important, but they are not ultimately real. They can be important, but not real. So for instance, we have lines of latitude and longitude, right? And if I said the 32nd parallel runs right through Carlisle, would any of you ever trip over it? No. Now you laugh because you know that the lines of latitude and longitude are not real. You can't trip over them. But they're really important because if you ever fly anywhere, you need them to get where you're going. This is the idea of Maya, illusion. Just because it's an illusion doesn't mean it's not important. And one of the illusions that we have is that we are a self, that we are a person, and that we endure. Whereas, according to Buddhism, you never were, you are not now, and you will not be. Once you come to peace with that, that is nirvana, according to Buddhism. Now, are you all okay if I tell you one more story? Are we okay with one more story? Okay. So we're going to wind our way back to the West. And I'm going to tell you a story called The Hymn of the Robe of Glory. I'm going to tell it to you quickly. It's a beautiful story, and afterwards I'll tell you where you can find it if you want to read it for yourself. In this story, it begins with a king and queen. They have a son, the prince. And the prince has a beautiful purple robe that has all sorts of sparkly jewels inlaid into the beautiful plush purple robe. The king and queen tell the prince that he is to leave behind his purple robe and go on a trip down to Egypt in order to get a pearl that is being held by a dragon at the bottom of the ocean. So, the prince takes off his purple robe, leaves it with the king and queen. He is given some provisions, as it says in the text, not too much for him to carry, but enough that he would need. He goes down to Egypt, and when he gets to Egypt, he puts on the garb of the Egyptians, and then he meets a stranger. And that stranger warns him, don't eat the food of the Egyptians. That's it. And then the prince is wandering through Egypt, and eventually he gets hungry. And so he sits down to eat, and he eats the food of the Egyptians. And as soon as he does that, he forgets about who he is, who sent him, and what he was sent to do. And he then becomes a slave to Pharaoh in Egypt. And this goes on for many years until suddenly the king and queen are like, hey, what happened to that prince? We sent him down there. And they send a messenger with a scroll to find the prince. And the messenger finds the prince, gives him the scroll. Immediately upon seeing the signatures and the writing on the scroll, the prince remembers who he is and what he was sent for. And the story goes, he uses the scroll as a magical breathing apparatus and a flashlight and a map, all of those things. Like, this is before there were smartphones. He uses the scroll to go underwater, and then he uses the scroll when he finds the dragon. He reads from the scroll in order to put the dragon to sleep. He takes the pearl, uses the scroll again, and finds his way back to the kingdom, where at the gates of the kingdom, he exchanges his pearl for the robe of glory. That's the story. Now, I'm going to tell you, it's an allegory. Every single part of the story is a stand-in for something else. That's what an allegory is. And we don't have enough time to go through all the different parts, but let's see if we can figure out what any of the parts are. What is the kingdom from whence the prince came? What?
Heaven.
Heaven. The kingdom of heaven. Who would be the king and queen? It's a kind of a tricky question.
God and Mrs. God?
What?
God and Mrs. God?
God. Okay. God. We're going to stick with just God for now. I'll explain why in a minute. So, the prince is sent by God down, and what is Egypt? The world. This earth. What is wearing the garb of the Egyptians?
Becoming man.
Becoming mortal, human flesh and blood. This mortal coil. The garb of the Egyptians is this body. He eats of the food of the Egyptians. And I'm going to have to help you out in the interest of time, right? He becomes slave to the pleasures and pains that come with having a body. And he forgets all about his mission. Now, the prince meets these messengers sent by the king and queen that have a scroll. This is the real important part of the story. On the scroll is writing. Now, writing in Greek, which is what this story might have been written in originally, is logos. The Gospel of John begins, in the beginning was the Word. The word in that is logos, and that stands for Jesus. So the message that he got might have been Jesus, right? Explaining to him what he's supposed to do. But logos is also an important word for the Greek philosophers. It means reason, rationality. So the scroll might be a symbol of reason or rationality. Or the scroll with writing on it could mean something like the Bible, the Torah, which is a scroll with writing on it. So it could appeal to Christians, Jews, and philosophers. In any case, he uses this to find the dragon and get the pearl. Notice he doesn't kill the dragon. He only puts the dragon to sleep. I'll let you ponder that. He gets the pearl, and he returns back to heaven with the pearl and exchanges the pearl for the robe of glory. What is the robe of glory? Remember, it's dark blue with sparkly gems in it. The sky, or the universe. Okay, now think about it for a minute. The garb of the Egyptians is this mortal coil. His real garb is the universe, right? He is the universe. And what is the pearl? I heard somebody ask. What is the pearl? The pearl is, we talked about this last time, knowledge, wisdom, self-knowledge, right? Remember the Gnostics who we talked about last time? The knowledge of self. What knowledge in particular? The knowledge that he is the universe. He is not this particular Egyptian. He is the entire universe, including mom and dad, the king and queen, God and Mrs. God, right? The reason why it's a king and queen is because this was probably written by a Gnostic person for whom there is a masculine and feminine deity. But he, the prince, is both of them. So why would he give himself this assignment? What else is there to do if you're God? Right?
So what is the dragon?
I'll let you worry about that. But what I want to point out is that this story, it goes by the name of the Hymn of the Robe of Glory. It also goes by the name of the Hymn of the Pearl, but it also has a third title, which is the Hymn of the Soul. The Hymn of the Soul. And remember last time we talked about the Gospel of Thomas? This is attributed to that same Thomas. And it said that Thomas, here's some mind-blowing things. This is not the doubting Thomas of the Gospels. This is Deutero Thomas. Deutero can mean second, but it can also mean twin. And it's suggested that this Thomas is the twin brother of Jesus. And that this Thomas, after Jesus was crucified, went to, guess where? India, to proclaim the Gospels. And that in India, he was arrested, and while in jail awaiting his death, wrote this story. This story was preserved by the Catholic Church, but never released until the 20th century. Too close to pantheism. And so the Hymn of the Pearl is suggesting exactly what Hinduism and Buddhism are suggesting, which is that your thought of who you are is just an illusion. It's a costume. It's a temporary garb. But that you are, whether you want to call it Atman Brahman, the supreme deity, the universe, or Anatman, absolutely nothing. One could interpret all of those in the same way. And this is what I would suggest religion is trying to teach us through myth. Now there's a handout which is from Joseph Campbell about the hero's journey. Now you know where the Gospel of Thomas can be found. It's an apocryphal gospel. And the Hymn of the Robe of Glory, I would be surprised if you couldn't find it in this library. When you read it along with the Joseph Campbell adventure, his story about the mythic adventure, and you'll see that this is sort of the archetype of that story. There's a lot more than I had to tell, but we ran out of time. We're 10 minutes late. I am happy to entertain questions from anybody who has them, but if anybody needs to go, I also understand that. So at this point, I will let anybody who wants to go, and anybody who has a question to ask any questions they want. Yes?
All right, you've been arguing very cogently that myths need to be interpreted in the cultures from which they come. It seems to me that Joseph Campbell is doing the opposite. He's saying he has a monomyth which explains everything. I, as an anthropologist, don't really think that's true. And I'm particularly bothered by his saying that the hero's journey applies to women, and then he doesn't explain how. So I'm just wondering what you're...
Okay. So the question, for those of you who might not have heard it, is that I was suggesting that in order to properly interpret myths, you need to understand the cultures from which they come. And the anthropologist who's asking the question says, I think that Joseph Campbell giving a monomyth, that's sort of the handout that I gave you, is ignoring that. What I would say is, I do believe that Joseph Campbell, if you read his writings, he is able to look at those myths in their cultures but what he does with the monomyth is sort of extrapolates out from the detailed specifics the sort of general patterns that he sees. He's not imprinting on them, but extrapolating out. It's sort of like if you were to look at the stock market, which looks like a whole jumble of mess, and try to pull out from it certain patterns and see what you can sort of predict from it. It's a terrible analogy, but that's how I'd answer that. The second part of the question was that Joseph Campbell said that the hero's journey also applies to women. But he doesn't say how. I've also read Joseph Campbell say that women don't need a hero's journey because they're already the great mother. I don't believe either of those. And there's been a lot of work since Joseph Campbell by those who hold Joseph Campbell in high regard, but have ventured out to look at what is the myth of stories that apply to women. And I don't have the references right at my fingertips, but I would suggest that you take a look at those. Yes?
You said a problem in my mind. You said the Gospel of Thomas is not doubting Thomas. But I read the Gospel of Judas and the Gospel of Mary. How does this all come together?
Okay, so the Gospel of Judas, which was only found a few decades ago, and the Gospel of Mary, also newly discovered, these were, so far as we can tell, somewhat common in the first, or more likely the 2nd century CE. But after the Nicene Creed, these non-canonical, non-approved texts were sort of cut out of the story. And so the Gospel of Thomas is interesting in that, unlike the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas, which were eradicated, was preserved by the Catholic Church, just not released. So, all of them, I think, are very interesting in order to get a better understanding of the canonical Gospels and to understand Jesus in his times. And they all have something worthwhile to extrapolate from them.
The point I'm asking is, how do you know the Gospel of Thomas is not by doubting Thomas?
Oh,
The other ones,
how do I know that?
why aren't they also some?
Well, the Gospel of Thomas is attributed to Deuterotomas, and in the canonical Gospels, Deuterotomas is different from the person known as Doubting Thomas. So this is more scholarly research that I'm relying on, but that's the basic answer.
Well, that solves the problem I've had.
Okay. Yes.
In the impermanence of Buddhism,
Yes.
how does Buddhism deal with one person taking another person's life?
It's a very good question. It's too easy to say that this is all Maya, therefore it doesn't matter, right? That is a simplistic reading of Buddhism. Buddhism recognizes what it calls the thusness of existence. In other words, here you are, right now, right now. And Buddhism, though it has, a number of, the Eightfold Noble Path and a number of different prohibitions and other things like that, I would argue that Buddhism fundamentally relies on the practitioner growing into and experiencing empathy for oneself in order to understand why murder should not happen. And that would include everything from an ant on up, if you will. The best example that I can give of this is, you may recall during the Vietnam War, there were Buddhist nuns who sat down on a street corner in meditation and then lit themselves on fire in protest of, at the time it was actually in protest of the closing of Buddhist monasteries and temples. But what this act shows simultaneously is how there is a transcendent realm, because if you, unfortunately, there is video of this. It's graphic. I wouldn't recommend looking at it, but if you do, you will see they remain perfectly still. There is no screaming, there's no yelling, there's no movement. In other words, their meditation practice is so deep that it is not disturbed by being lit on fire. So there's that one aspect of it, yet they're doing it out of protest, meaning what? This world matters. Politics matter. The things that happen here and now matter. So in this one action, they are proclaiming both.
I gotta go, but I wanna thank you. Listen, I'm anxious to hear your next presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, thank you.